Good afternoon. See how we're doing? Thank you. We're getting here. That's good. Thank you so much for finding your way. My name is Rick Simonson, and in being up here, I get a chance to visit. There are seats up here too as you come in. It's also the nature of the festival. Okay, we'll begin. Oh, except for everyone's coming.
Can I request everyone to please maintain silence? There are seats up in front. There are seats here. Please maintain silence. We are about to begin the session. Thank you very much. Those at the back, there are seats in front. Thank you.
Okay, we'll begin in welcoming Abraham Verghese here a few years after, 3 years now after his novel Cutting for Stone was published. We're getting a chance to welcome someone that the festival has almost gotten here the last 2 years. Sure, okay. Okay, I'm fine. Oh, I'm fine for that. I'm fine for that. It's like debate and silence.
You want to announce that?
Okay. We'll wait a minute more to begin, just because it is distracting with everyone coming in.
Rick Simonson. We will wait for another minute or two for the rest of the people to come in, since there's been a shift last minute, and then start the session. Thank you very much.
And again, to say welcome and thank you very much for being here and finding here after the change of venue. My name is Rick Simonson, and I work in a bookstore in Seattle. And I've been coming to this festival for a few years, and there's nothing like it I've found anywhere in the world. So it's a thrill and privilege to be able to be doing this here. It's also a thrill and privilege to be up here with Abraham Verghese. It was 1994, almost 20 years ago, that and actually, Abraham was a newly published author with his first book, a book entitled My Own Country, an extraordinary, moving book of his nonfiction book about his work as a young doctor treating early cases of AIDS patients, and that was just part of it, but a remarkable and extraordinary book. And I think it may have been Abraham's very first public kind of appearance for it was actually at a book convention in New York, or somewhere in the East Coast of the U.S. And Abraham was part of a group of new writers, and they all were taking their turns, just one, doing things. And a woman who was attending that, she had to leave, and she turned around and was walking out of the room, and she stopped when she heard this voice. And it was the voice of Abraham Verghese reading. And the tone of his voice as it's speaking, which we'll get to some of the other things Abraham does besides write, but it's very much in the language of his books. And My Own Country was followed a few years later by another extraordinary memoir, nonfiction book called The Tennis Partner. And then 3 years ago, some of us who'd been waiting for this book a long time, Cutting for Stone, and a book that many of us were so thrilled to get, and be able to start putting in people's hands, a book that's gone into people's hands ever since. And I know this festival almost got Abraham the next 2 years, and then various things came up. So this is Abraham's first public visit as a writer in India, doing something like this. So welcome, Abraham, and it's great that you're here. And we'll get to more other parts about India as well as part of this, but it's great you're here. And I believe you just got in this morning, flying from California.
Rick, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for hosting this discussion. Yes, I just got in this morning, and I'm not jet-lagged yet, so I'm really excited to be here. It's hard to grasp what the Jaipur Book Festival is like until you actually arrive here and walk around, and I'm still getting the sense of it. So
he did get to pose for photographs with Shamila Tagore for his mother. Just before this, he says, he walked in and said, "Oh my God, look at this!" So that's already a moment to have at the festival. Cutting for Stone, which is a book that has been out for a few years now, is a book that does many things, and will slide into one of those, which is really how much medicine and doctoring is in the book. But it's also a book of a lot of fateful turns in people's lives. There's a the central character, named Marion Stone, at various points has so many things happen with a twin brother, Shiva, and with, I mean, I guess starting with his parents, his birth. Could you say a little bit about the role of fate and destiny, which are sort of woven through a few different elements of the book, and what part they seem to play to you as a writer? I mean,
Well, I'm not sure that I began writing Cutting for Stone with a theme in mind. I think theme sort of emerges. I was writing a book very much about the themes that interested me, about a precocious child entering medicine and discovering sort of the excitement of medicine through his parents, and secondarily discovering the truths of life. And I think that I'm very much someone who feels that you tend to earn what you tend to reap what you sow. You tend to make your own destiny happen. And so I think some of those themes are themes that I strongly believe in, that kept being resurrected in the book. But I didn't set out to write a polemic. I didn't set out to make a case about faith or a case about destiny. It just seemed like it sort of evolved that way.
But part of it is the part that geography plays. I mean, you have characters almost, except for the young woman Janae and some of the people in her family, all of the characters in this book pretty much have either come from India, or India's been a part of their background, Thomas Stone having spent some time there. So they are all, at the beginning of the book, in Ethiopia. I mean, that's a place they've all gotten to by various decisions and things. And then as the book goes, especially for Marion, there's a leaving of Ethiopia, coming to America. So there's a part of it that would seem like it's his way of making these decisions and coming to insights.
Yeah, I think that I really had a strong sense that geography was terribly important. I heard many years ago, in medical school actually, I heard the phrase that geography is destiny. And it was a phrase ascribed to Freud. Freud was said to have said that geography is destiny, and Freud was talking about the proximity of the birth canal to all the interesting organs nearby. And I thought that was profound. It's so clever of Freud to have said that. And I found out many years later that Freud never said that Napoleon said that. Or if Freud said it, he was paraphrasing Napoleon. But I think there's great truth in that phrase, Rick. Geography is destiny. It applies in my life. I mean, my parents were from Kerala in the south of India, and they changed their geography. They took jobs as teachers in Ethiopia, and their destiny completely changed. And I was born in Ethiopia, and therefore my destiny was completely different from that of my parents. And when we changed our geographies at various times, I changed because of war. I left for America. My destiny changed again, and I really wanted to play with that theme of how a life is utterly changed by geography. It seems fairly self-evident, but I think there's more to it than is self-evident.
One of the amazing things you do in the book, it's sort of in the narrative, is that you have the beginning of the book is a pretty extended, long birth scene, and Marion, the primary character, or the primary character, it's his birth, and along with his brother Shiva's. You're able to take a narrative that sort of goes back, obviously, before Marion was, conscious and aware, and then takes it through different stages of his awareness and consciousness. And then later in the book, when he's actually almost comatose, you're able to keep a narrative going. Could you talk a little about, in the writing of the book, how you see that part of the story being told? I mean, how are you able to sort of keep what feels like a personal narrative going, even though there are times when that person couldn't have been narrating it?
Yeah, it's a tricky sort of thing to do. I love the first person voice, so I started with, that voice. My brother Shiva and I were born in the year of our Lord. It was just a nice voice that had an old-fashioned ring to it. And yet the problem with the first person is you can't know everything. And so there's a point in the book where I hope quietly, segue into the third person, and I hope that the reader doesn't notice. And I think the rule of thumb is that if you get away with it, you get away with it. And I was very much influenced by The Tin Drum, by Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum. How many of you know The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass? Wonderful book. And you know, there's a moment in the book where Oscar, the narrator, is talking about how his mother was conceived and how his grandmother was hiding in the potato fields. No, she was working in the potato fields, and she wears 12 layers of petticoats, and she rotates them every week. And she happened to be out in the potato fields and saw this man being chased by policemen in the distance. And he ran this way, he ran that way, and he finally came and hid under Oscar's grandmother's skirt, and that's how Oscar's mother was conceived. And you know, you never stop to ask, how in the world would Oscar know this? And so I think the moral is, if you get away with it, you get away with it. And I very much wanted to have a voice that was very personal, very informed, and yet segue into things that must have been told to the narrator. And for the most part, I think readers haven't noticed, but I've seen a couple of comments on Twitter and elsewhere where, oh, I just put down the book because clearly then the writer switched from something to something and doesn't know what he's doing. So I lost a few people, I think.
Well, it works. That's part of. But that's what I was asking, because I wondered how you formulated that, because I've seen writers stumble over very much, either trying to say it all in first person where it doesn't work, or they don't know quite how to back in and work the other parts in.
I should say that I give a lot of credit to my editor, Robin Desser, someone that you know well.
Yeah.
I think the writer just writes, and you have to have someone you trust say to you, you know, this is wonderful writing, this 100 pages is beautiful, but it doesn't belong in this book. And to have 2 or 3 months of your work erased like that, you have to trust the person. And Robin was great at saying, don't worry, this works. You're making this transition, but somehow it seems to work. I don't know how. Keep going.
How long was the book in the writing?
The book took me 8 years to write. 8 years.
Okay.
And the reason is because, I have a day job. I stay pretty busy. And I didn't think it would take 8 years. I actually thought that I would be done much sooner than that. But I think one of the problems is that I didn't really know the whole book. All I knew was this opening scene of a beautiful South Asian nun giving birth in an operating room in a mission hospital in Africa, and I just kept pushing that voice forward. And that's actually a very inefficient way to write, because you wind up taking these big detours and then realize, well, that's not the book, and then you have to backtrack. So the process was much longer than I anticipated.
Since you mentioned medicine and that as a day job, a central part of the book, in and around the movements, the revolution that happens in the middle of the book in Ethiopia, but the book is so marked by operations, by medicine, and whether it's, I was thinking about almost the number of blockage surgeries in the book, from pregnancy to intestinal surgery, and an incredible visceral sense in the book of what doctors, treating people do. But that's not so common in fiction. So what was that like, working it into fiction? For you, did it feel like, since you had written that way in nonfiction, but certainly it's not so common.
Yeah, it was certainly something that was a lot of fun for me. I'm not a surgeon. I'm an internist by training. I'm an internal medicine physician, an infectious disease physician. So I actually had a lot of fun putting in all those surgical elements in the novel. When I was in medical school, I actually loved everything. I loved medicine, I loved surgery, pediatrics. I had a hard time choosing what field to go into, but when I chose medicine, I had a strong sense that I was turning my back on all the drama and history and folklore of surgery. And so the great joy of writing the novel was to be able to become a student of surgery, in a sense. And I attended a lot of operations with my colleagues, and got to sort of watch them and see how they think and ask them how they think, and that was a lot of fun. But I would argue that some people have suggested that maybe the novel is too medical, that it's got too much medicine in it, and I would argue that medicine is life. It's really life plus, and one of the great privileges I feel about being in medicine is that you're really with people at the most critical moments of their life, at the moments that count the most in terms of their weightiness, in terms of their magnitude, and all emotions get simplified and crystallized down to the bare essentials. And so I would argue that if you're writing a novel about medicine, you're really writing a novel about life. That's how I saw it.
But you do manage to make the language artful. I mean, it's a lot of writing about medical matters is scientific, or it's locked in a kind of jargon, and including specialist jargon. But you, in the novel, I mean, I think everyone does. I'm sure people get kind of squeamish reading some of it. But do you feel in what you're conveying that there is sometimes, and it's hard for me to extrapolate what in different parts of the world, but in the United States, a kind of people trying to avoid, certain things, and it's easier. I mean, it's how we keep ourselves removed from poverty, from insulated from more things, including illness and knowing what happens in our bodies. You face that and get into that with this book in a very forthright way. So I didn't know if you felt like maybe you don't write from that place, but is that something you feel is in the culture is not dealing with this enough?
I'm not sure I got the question. Do I feel that people don't necessarily want to hear about these sorts of things?
In a way, yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Well, I guess my vision is so skewed because I think there's actually something quite beautiful about medicine, and especially in this modern era where we're so technologically dependent. I find us drifting away from the moments in medicine that are especially beautiful, and I wanted to, call on those and come back to those in a certain way, and to contrast medicine in a resource-poor environment like Ethiopia, and compare that to medicine in a technologically very advanced place like America, and point out that as different as they are, the basics are still the same. You still need someone who cares. You still need a physician-patient relationship, and so I actually had a lot of fun exploring it. And even though I think you're right, people don't necessarily want to read about gruesome things. I was told long ago, maybe by you, but maybe by someone else, that any book that was about a doctor, a dog, one more thing I can't remember, was a foolproof way to keep the reader's interest. So I did the doctor and the dog thing. The third thing might have been sex. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. You mentioned the day job, which since Abraham's been published, he, I believe, was in El Paso for several years, and then San Antonio, and now for about 6 or 7 years has been at Stanford University, where you have a title, but it's about the theory and practice of medicine, which is teaching, but it's also active doctoring. And you've been writing articles too as well about what that practice is, which is about doctors and patients. Could you talk a little about what that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I didn't invent this. I'm just trying to promote something that I strongly believe in. I mean, I think that all medicine at some level is not just about curing, but it's also about healing. And when I say curing and healing, I know that sounds sort of corny, but I like to use an example with my students, which I'd love to use with you. If you were to go from this meeting, God forbid, back to your hotel rooms, back to your homes, and when you got to your hotel room or your home, you found that the door had been broken into, the lock is in splinters, and you go into your room and you find that all your belongings are strewn about, and all your valuables are gone. Your passport, your money, your computer, jewelry, all gone. If the police come by an hour later and say, we caught the person who did this, here's all your stuff back, you will be cured, but you will not necessarily be healed. Your sense of violation will be so strong that someone broke into your home, your apartment, that you might even choose to move from there. You might go to another hotel. And I think I like that analogy because I think all illness has those two components. People come to us with symptoms that are very concrete, and sometimes we're able to completely take care of them, very often not. But there's always a subtext that's not about the symptom, and the subtext is often, Daddy, Mommy, please help me, or, please say this is going to be all right. And I think that aspect of medicine is, it's unchanging, it's time-honored, it's in great danger, even though it remains, to me, an integral part of medicine. And so I think a lot of what I write and teach about focuses on that aspect of things. And again, I don't think I, by any means, invented that. I'm just trying, in this day and age when we're very technologically driven, I think even in India, some of our very advanced hospitals, there's a great danger that the technology is getting ahead of the patient, in a sense, and I invented the term in Silicon Valley, which I became very unpopular for. I invented the term the eye patient, like your iPhone, your iPod, the eye patient. And I said in a magazine that the patient in the bed has become a mere icon for the real patient who's in the computer. And that entity, the eye patient, is getting wonderful care all across America. The real patient is often wondering, where is everyone? When are they going to come see me? Who's going to explain what's going on? And, that dichotomy interests me, and I've become sort of passionate about trying to speak about it.
There does feel like there's a moment in Cutting for Stone that part of you, or is there when Marion is in America being a resident, and he talks to, I think it's Mr. Walters, an older man who is in there, and whether or not he's drinking or not. I mean, he's got an ulcer condition which is getting worse, and he finally has to give him the first time a bad diagnosis, and he's never done that. So there's that moment of being straight on, forthright with a patient, straight. And in fact, I think while he's having that conversation, his beeper went off or something, and you actually convey very movingly what that is, just in a doctor and a person. It's not even the patient becomes something different almost. You've been very human there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I actually used a riddle which recurs throughout the book. I hope I'm not giving too much away for people who haven't read the book, but there's a riddle that one doctor asks of another doctor, and the riddle is, what treatment in an emergency is administered by ear? And the answer is words of comfort. And in many ways, that was a metaphor for what I've been getting at. It's interesting. I mean, I've written this novel, which is fictional, but I find it striking that the themes of my novel and the themes of my nonfiction tend to be the same. It's the same monomania that infuses itself in many different forms.
This next question's actually got a flip over part. The first part being your work as a doctor. How do you feel it informs and affects you as a writer?
I'm not sure that, I think there's the obvious things. I've always felt that being trained in internal medicine, my specialty, is a particularly good training for being a physician, because you're observing all the time. I mean, I have a hard time in airports and even in situations like this, because I'm always seeing thyroid nodules, I'm seeing eyes that are, one lid is lagging, I'm picking up, tinea versicolor, and I'm, I can't help myself. My brain is just going off like that. And I think as a writer, that stands you in good stead, because it's really significant detail that counts. I remember hearing both in medical school and also at the Iowa Writers Workshop, I heard the phrase, God is in the details. That, it's the details that make something become whole. And I think medical training is good for that. But that said, I don't think medicine gives you anything more than that. I think it gives you, unfortunately, the converse. I get a lot of terrible manuscripts from physicians sent to me with the conviction that this is the next best great thing, and the sense that they don't really need to invest in learning how to write. It should be sufficient that they have something to say. We should all stop and listen. And what I mean to say is that's not enough. I'm very privileged to have a view of a very, a world of where people are going through very difficult times. But it still takes a lot of effort to try and translate some of that into something meaningful for a reader that works on the page. I have not, for example, I have not put MD behind my name on any book I've written, because I don't think it should be significant to the reader whether you're a physician or a social worker or a waiter. What matters is the words on the page, and do they work, and do they keep the reader turning the page. That's all that matters. But I felt very well trained by being a physician in being able to observe and pull things together.
you've sort of worked your way into the other part of that question, which turning it around, and I'm reminded that the Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, was a psychologist, and he said people do ask me how being a psychologist affects my work, but they don't always ask how writing poetry affected his work as a psychologist, and he had an interesting answer about attention language. But do you feel writing, which included going to the Iowa Writers Workshop and learning there, has that affected the part of practice of medicine?
Yeah, actually, I think it has, in a way that's not immediately evident. I always feel that I write in order to understand what I'm thinking. So, you can set out to write a book about something, and you think you know what you're going to write about, and yet in the process of the writing, I think you come to a new level of understanding. So, my first book, My Own Country, was supposed to be about AIDS in a small town in Tennessee, and it was. But my understanding of that medical experience that I went through was just something that I would never have come to, but in writing the book. Something about the writing opens up your understanding. So I think that's even true of a magazine article. I mean, if I just walked by the river and thought about what I was going to write, it's actually very different from when I sit down to write, because I think you tap into some other part of the brain. I don't know, call it the muse, call it the right brain, and you wind up coming up with some understanding that you didn't have before. So I often feel that in writing, I come to a better understanding of something medical than I do by just thinking about it.
My Own Country, I don't know if I know it's available here, but I don't know if it's really been published so widely in India. And it's a book I totally commend, because not only is he says it more than being a young doctor with treating AIDS patients, but it's also a book about, and this book does, Cutting for Stone, has some of these young doctors who are immigrants into the U.S. finding their way into these smaller cities, but it's very much also about being an immigrant, hanging out with the cab drivers and sort of other who are sort of on the fringes of the community, but then at the same time, because he's a doctor, treating people at the most vulnerable, but also sort of all classes, including the sort of more privileged classes. So you did this beautiful thing in that book with that, among other things. We're in India, and you just having arrived this morning, but it is a place that has a lot of connection and resonance for you in your work and in your life. Could you talk a little about, in Cutting for Stone, what part India plays? Because it does have a part where...
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was just thinking that, every time I arrive in India, I'm conscious that the pulse that beats in me is very much my Indian pulse, and I sometimes get a little removed from it, but it's never very far away. My parents are from Kerala, and we would come home from Ethiopia on summer vacation pretty much every year, every other year. And then I started medical school in Africa, but because of civil war and unrest, the school closed down. I became an orderly in America, but I eventually finished medical school in Madras in India, Chennai, and that was a very important period in my life. I think that training was so wonderful in terms of the emphasis in India on examining the patient, the emphasis on physical signs, and to the degree that I have a reputation in America now, it's ironic that it's based on the stuff I learned in medical school. It's not based on some fancy research I did subsequently. So I remain very, very grateful to those roots. I come to India fairly often, but not necessarily for book-related things. I've come for other things. But I'm setting my next novel in India, in Kerala, and that has allowed me to really try to learn so much more about Kerala than I thought I knew. It turns out I know very little, so I'm very excited by that.
Yeah, you've written a little about some of that work, because you've had some articles in the New York Times, I believe, and some other places.
I wrote about the visit about a year ago, indeed. Yeah.
How far along is that?
Well, the novel's coming along very slowly. I mean, I think it's, I'm again wrestling with process. I think we talked about the fact that I began the other book with just a voice and an image and kept trying to push it forward, and I'm very keen to not waste as much time as I did last time. So I'm actually trying to sketch out the whole book and try to know where it goes, and it's actually very hard. I was actually having a good conversation with Michael Andanche on stage a week ago, talking about books, and our mutual friend John Irving feels very strongly that you have to know the whole book before you start writing. He knows the last sentence before he begins writing the book. He knows everything that's going to happen. He will say, you know, if you don't know what's happening, and if you don't know what to hide, when to reveal, if you're just making it up as you go along, then, he said this to me, then Abraham, you're not a writer, you're just an ordinary liar. You're just making it up as you go along. And then someone like Michael Andanche would say that, you know, it's the not knowing that is precisely the pleasure in writing, and the pleasure to the reader, because there are surprises that come about. And it may well be that ultimately, you know, people like Michael, who I suspect does a lot of exploring and writing these little pieces and pulling together collages, that is his way of knowing the whole book, kind of the way John knows the whole book. So I'm wrestling between those two things. I have a big whiteboard in my living room with all the characters mapped out, and the trouble is every time I try and write, I wind up deviating from the whiteboard, and so I have to go back and rearrange the whiteboard. So it's coming. It's frustrating, but I think that's the nature of the process.
You mentioned the Tin Drum. Are there other writers or books that, in either what you're writing now or in your development as a writer, have it affected you strongly?
You know, there's so many that it seems almost unrealistic to try and name just a few. But I love, you know, everyone from Dickens and that era of writers, but to Graham Greene, to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, to a whole host of contemporary writers. But I also read things like Ian Rankin's mystery novels set in Scotland. For some reason, I'm a sucker for that, and so I'm not as discerning a reader as some people would assume. I read very widely.
Do you have a regular writing practice relative to your medical practice in terms of time and writing?
I wish I did. I mean, Stanford has been very good to me in that for the first time, a medical school has said that your writing is the equivalent of another physician's research, and so they have given me protected time to write. And when I'm not on the wards in 2-week blocks taking care of inpatients, I actually have some flexibility, and I have a second office that I disappear to and write. I can tell you where it is, but then I have to kill you. It's a secret office. No one really knows where it is.
We won't tell anyone back in the States what it is. Yeah.
And but I actually wind up writing at home a lot more than in any office. I think I wind up writing late at night, and whenever I can. It's still, you know, I have between my kids and their needs and my exes and their needs. There's a lot of, you know, demands on my time, and so it's catch as catch can whenever you can.
Yeah. You aren't teaching right now. You're having a break.
Sorry?
You're not teaching right now. You said Stanford's giving you a little break from teaching.
Teaching writing, did you mean?
No, teaching at medicine.
Well, you know, we teach medicine not by lecturing, but we teach by sort of an apprenticeship. So when I'm on the wards, I have one resident, 2 interns, 4 students, and we're, you know, that's the way the teaching takes place. There's not a lot of lectures. There's some seminars and some morning reports, but not a lot of lecturing. So in a sense, I'm teaching all the time, and I feel like, you know, the thing I'm carrying with me to read on the plane is not just a novel, but a review book of internal medicine, because it's important to keep up if you're going to keep up with your residents.
As many know, My Own Country was made into a film, and I believe there's something in the works for Cutting for Stone. Is that it making...
Yeah, the movie rights for Cutting for Stone have been sold, and by a very good production company, Anonymous Content, who made Being John Malkovich and so on. And they have a script, and they're looking for, I think, the big studio to chip in. So I'm sort of very removed from that process. I find it a very hard thing to, you know, to look hopefully for that to happen.
Yeah.
Most books that are optioned don't get made, and so I try to stay with what I control.
Okay. I think we may move to questions. If we'd like to open this up a little bit. I think they'll get a microphone going.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to hear you speak.
Thank you.
I wanted to know why you felt the need to kill Shiva. or why his character, why couldn't he survive?
So I think we should.
Sorry,
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler
first.
alert, sorry.
You know, I think there were 2 or 3 moments where characters disappeared in the novel, and when I came to that point in the writing, I was surprised. You know, I mean, I actually, you know, really got quite emotional when one of the characters I realized was going to die, and you know, I'm not sure that I felt that I had a need to kill anybody. It just seemed imperative at that moment that that's really the truth of what was going to happen. You know, and there's a strange sort of truth that holds in a novel. The novelist Dorothy Allison says that fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. You know, the power of fiction is that there's a truth to it. There's a sort of sense of, you know, yeah, this is how the world is. And I get very impatient with people who tell me, oh, I don't read fiction, I only read nonfiction. I'm a serious kind of person. And I always say, yeah, you're a serious kind of person? Have you heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin? That book ended slavery in America. That book and the way it captured the public's imagination ended slavery. So that's a long-winded way of saying there are moments in the narrative where what I want don't seem to matter. There's an inherent inevitability, an inherent truth to what's going to happen that I can't stop, and it felt like that, you know, with the character you mentioned.
Another question. One thing that comes up a lot in Cutting for Stone is your use of humor, body and otherwise. Could you say a little about how that comes about? Because it's, again, that may not be a given in a novel with revolution, war, surgery, but there's a lot of humor in here.
Well, I mean, thank you. I think medicine is inherently full of humor, and you have to be very careful because it can seem very macabre to the patient. So you have to sort of be very careful how you voice this. But medicine is inherently full of, you know, humor, and the delicate thing is to use it well. But I collected all these wonderful anecdotes from my medical student days and my training days, and I always wanted a place to put them.
Were the limericks yours that Ghosh uses?
Yeah, some of the things that Ghosh does, the vasectomy stuff, you know, these are all sort of juicy things that my editor, Robin, kept wanting to take them out. And I kept pushing to keep them in, and I think for the most part, I'm happy that we kept them in.
Like I am, yes. Oh, yes?
Hi. We read your book. I belong to a book club. And we immensely enjoyed the book, so I wanted to compliment you on how well written the book is. My question is about Shiva again. He was a very intriguing character in your book. And you almost had a very gentle side of him where he learns dancing. And you do it so beautifully without making him sound feminine almost. Was that a deliberate attempt?
I'm not sure I heard your question well. Is this about Dr. Ghosh you're asking, who had a gentle...
Shiva learns dancing.
Oh, okay, yeah. And you're asking why that came about?
Yeah, was that a deliberate attempt at making him a little more... He did not sound feminine, and yet...
Yeah. You know, so Shiva was an interesting character for me to write because I meant for Shiva to have like Asperger's syndrome, where he's socially inept, he has a hard time connecting with people, he doesn't read social cues very well. And the trouble with that is that my colleagues pointed out to me that in the scene with Hema on the plane where she confronts the pilot and grabs him in this very awkward anatomical region, that he remembers my mother and he and I on a plane to Aden. And I remember this part, that my mother threw a fit and she didn't grab the captain by his balls, but she should have, or she made him think she would. But there was a little boy on the plane in the scene I wrote who was holding a toy plane, and he falls and breaks his leg. Well, my brother remembers that I was holding a toy plane throughout that voyage, and I don't remember it at all. And the second thing that happened was I'm seeing a therapist, which, don't look at me, we all should be seeing therapists, I wish it were free. And he's reading my book. It's very interesting to have your therapist read your novel, because he begins to point out to you all these things that are recurring in your novel and in real life, you know. So I've changed my answer from saying, oh, it's not autobiographical, to saying, all writing at some level is autobiography, even when it's, purportedly fiction.
Hi, I had a question for you.
Where are you? I can't see
I'm
you.
way in the back.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Can you wave?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
My question is, as a writer, it's often good when a writer is able to
Is that you, Sandeep?
It is Sandeep.
Yeah,
It is
good.
Sandeep.
How are you?
Good. I was just asking, as a writer, you often have to be a good listener. How does that compare with a physician's bedside manner, especially at a time when, family physicians are becoming a rarer and rarer breed?
I'm sorry, the audio is hard for me to hear from over there. One more time, Sandeep.
As a writer, you often also have to be a good listener. And I was wondering how that compares to, as a physician, having that bedside manner to listen to, what's going on with the patient. Do you find a correlation there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't really thought about that, but one of the great criticisms about physicians is that we don't listen very well. There's actually a statistic that the average American physician interrupts their patient in 14 seconds. And, for the longest time I had patients with chronic fatigue. I don't quite know how I wound up with a stable of chronic fatigue patients. You don't want that reputation. It's not a reputation you would wish on your worst enemy, that you're the chronic fatigue doctor. But I was, and I learned that the most important thing I could do for them was listen without interrupting. They had a great need to tell their story. Lots of people disbelieved them, their families disbelieved them. They had been through many medical encounters where they'd been rushed, and listening was terribly important. So I'm very conscious of listening as a physician, and I suppose that as a writer you're also watching and listening very closely. And some of that is apparent. I have a physician friend, a very distinguished man who's now nearly 90 years old, practices in a small town. He trained in Harvard, but then he went back to Laredo, Texas to practice where he was from. And he has 12 children, 9 of whom are physicians, 3 of whom practice with him. And they always talk about how their father manages to come into a patient's room, sit on the bed, put his hand on them, and act as though he has all the time in the world. And yet he's out of there much faster than the sons who come in and they have one foot in the door, they need to get to the cath lab, they're trying to ease out, and they wind up, taking more time. So I think sometimes the illusion of time is what is needed, the sense that you're completely focused on them at that moment. Thanks for that question.
Is the microphone somewhere else? Okay, yeah.
It really does follow quite nicely from that last answer. The question is, in terms of time management, you're obviously an extremely busy guy at the pinnacle of one profession and indeed another. How do you fit it all in? I mean, you explained a little bit about sabbaticals and how Stanford helps out, but is there a kind of rigorous discipline behind this, or is it just when the fancy takes you, you decide to write? I mean, how does it all work?
I'm going to trouble
We're having a hard time listening to
Okay, sorry, I shall repeat. The question is, do you have any tips for us about how to organize your time, given that you have so many different things that you do?
I wish I did. I mean, I think, I don't think that I have any shortcut. I don't think I'm more organized than anyone else. But I'm a big believer in the incremental method, whatever it is. If it's learning a second language or writing a book, doing something as much as you can every day, things add up. And so I think, just being faithful to the cause every single day. And I feel that I try to, bring that faithfulness to medicine. I'm trying to read late at night on the patient I just saw or the patients I saw so that it sinks in. And I'm also trying to write a few words to push this thing forward. And, a few words, and it adds up. And I think that's the great thing. I also feel like one of the things that has been a great boon to me in my writing, this is going to sound really weird, but I should say it, is that I've not been in a hurry. I've never been in a hurry. I've had the great luxury of a great day job that I love. I love medicine. I would easily give up writing before I gave up medicine. Medicine is really who I am. That's what defines me. And therefore, I could take my time about the writing and wait to get it right. In other words, You know, don't get me wrong. I wanted everything to happen for my books. I had great ambitions for them. And the things that have happened with Cutting for Stone have been absolutely wonderful. But if nothing happened, I would still be all right. And I think when you take the pressure off yourself as a writer to, you know, churn something out because you have to pay the college tuition for your kid or pay the bills, I've been blessed not to have that kind of pressure. And my writing friends who pay the bills with their writing, you know, I admire them. It's a discipline that I don't have. And so my advice would be, you know, if you can afford to, get it right, take your time, and do a little bit every day. That's the best I know.
It could probably be added that the same pressures on speed and time that are in medicine now do happen in publishing and writing, and you do have an editor that is very good at the other way, at patience and wanting her writers to take their time, because there is a pressure to hurry up and get the books done, and I think that can affect the writing too.
Yeah, but you know, I have 3 books under my belt. If you don't count another one called Infection in Nursing Homes and Long-Term Care Facilities, which a grand total of 60 copies were sold. You know, and Joyce Carol Oates has written 3 books since breakfast this morning, you know, so I feel I've not been terribly productive, but I feel proud of what I have written, so
But, yeah,
that's what counts, I suspect.
This book is part of that process. Isn't there a question out there? Over here, yes.
We read your book at our book club and enjoyed it thoroughly. The only conclusion we were unable to get is the title that you've given, Cutting for Stone. And everybody had their take on it, but we weren't able to conclude. So would you be able to throw some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that book clubs have been, you know, tremendously important to this book. The phenomenon of book clubs is really what propelled this book forward. So thank you. And I've always wanted to be a fly on the wall when a book club is reading my book. And I've actually showed up to many book clubs, but it turns out that when I show up, the experiment changes. Everybody is very willing to tell me how much they like the book. I don't think I hear the parts that they didn't like. But to come to the title, I've always felt that titles should be slightly mysterious, that they should, you know, that you should come to a place in the book and you should say, aha, I think this is what the title means. And I don't think that the author has the key. I mean, I don't think that I hold the key to what the title means. I think it, you know, I sometimes get these theses, master's theses sent to me about what my book means and how, you know, Verghese's use of the archetypal characters clearly indicates a, and I think, wow, if only if I was that clever, that would be really something, you know. So, but they're not wrong. I think every reader is entitled to their interpretation and does have their interpretation, which is why when you watch the movie version of a book, you're often disappointed because you had in mind a certain character that you constructed based on the words of the writer, and inevitably when they cast someone, they change that. But to come to the title, I'm going to tell you what the title, where it came from, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what the explanation is. Cutting for stone is a phrase in the Hippocratic Oath. When physicians graduate, one of the great joys of my life is standing with my students every year when they graduate, and they all stand up and they recite the Hippocratic Oath. And all the physicians in the audience are also invited to stand up and recite with them. So you have, you know, parents and siblings and all the faculty, we stand up. And we recite these ancient lines which really have no bearing in modern medicine in a funny way. And yet I enjoy it. You know, it's lines like, you know, I swear by Apollo, and, you know, and then somewhere in there is the line, I will not cut for stone, but leave it to those skilled in the profession. And that expression, cutting for stone, came from the fact that in medieval times, kidney stones, bladder stones were very, very common. People died excruciating deaths from big bladder stones. You know, we know that Samuel Johnson carried a catheter in his top hat and catheterized himself, you know, 10 times a day. Little children would die in agony from giant bladder stones, and we don't quite know why. We think it's the quality of the water supply at that time. And so there were these itinerant surgeons who were very skilled at traveling around and cutting in a very skilled fashion and getting the stone out. So they could cut over the pubic bone pull out a bladder stone, or they would put a finger in the rectum, another one on the belly, push down, hook the stone down into the anal region and make a cut 2 centimeters in front of the anus. This might be more detail than you want, but in the end they would relieve the suffering, and then they would wipe their knife on the cassock and head off to the next operation. There was no sterilization, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of death. And so the teaching was, don't try this unless you know what you're doing, but leave it to someone who's skilled. And I just liked the ring of that. It just had a good sound to it, cutting for stone. And, you know, it could mean all kinds of things, I suppose. And you'll be interested to know that my characters were not named Stone. My characters are named Thomas Pickering and Marion Pickering and Shiva Pickering. And I woke up one day 6 years into the book and I thought, you know, if I name them Stone, it'll all seem so clever. It'll tie in with the title. It'll be, you know, I think that's how things happen. And so what does it mean? I think it could mean many things. It could mean, you know, Marion looking for his father. It could mean, you know, trying to get to the heart of things. There's a line I think in Tennyson or in Yeats where he talks about the stone of the heart. And so all those things is what I meant. But mostly, whatever you thought it meant, you're right. That's what it meant.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I was wondering, you're from India, from Ethiopia, from the United States, whether this, you know, plethora of surroundings has in some way enhanced your vision as a person and also as a writer.
Where do my interests lie, did you say?
No, I was wondering whether the fact that you're a migrant, that you're somebody who comes from all over the place, whether this has enhanced your vision, enabled you to see things.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I'm envious of people who have hometowns and who know people for generations in the same town and grew up there and can go back to their grandparents' house. I never had that. I feel like I was, you know, born in Ethiopia. I still speak the language very well. And then I was displaced from there, from what I thought was my home. And in that displacement, I think, has been some sort of, you know, it was a hard thing personally, but it was a great literary point of view, if you like, because I always feel like I'm the outsider looking in, whether I'm in you know, El Paso, Texas, or in Tennessee. I was always the perennial outsider looking in, and I think that that's not a bad narrative strategy. One of the nicest things people have ever said about my first 2 books was, you know, we lived in Texas all our life, in El Paso, and we never saw what you saw. And I think being an outsider allows you to see things that other people don't see. And, you know, it's not a bad narrative strategy. I feel like I'm still struggling to find where I belong. I mean, there's no doubt, as I said, I feel the pulse of India always in me. But, you know, where I lay my head seems to depend on many things. And, you know, that's not a terrible thing. Thank you for that question. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.